In this tutorial, we are going to be covering rendering in Next.js. This is one of the most crucial topic in Next.js, so I can't wait to show you guys all the aspect of rendering in Next.js. So let's jump right into it. Hello guys, I'm Oliver. I'll be going over this tutorial. If you're new to the channel, make sure you check my other tutorial as well. It's on my YouTube. For this tutorial, all the links and resources will be down below. So GitHub and all the other easy to access resources. I also have a Discord server. So if you are interested in talking to all the other students as well, go ahead and join the Discord server as well. So when it comes to rendering in Next.js, we have to understand a few concepts, and I'm going to walk you guys over to the basic, making sure we understand the basic and then jump on, level up to the next one, and then level up to the next part of rendering. So we understand the whole picture of how Next.js kind of work and renders things. So first thing first, I will read a little bit here. React 18 and Next.js 13 introduced new ways to render your application, and this is a game changer. So this is why a lot of people are looking into switching to Next.js when they introduce server component, which kind of like render does like server side rendering by default, and you also have client component which does client side rendering. So I think in the previous lecture I showed you some example, but yeah, in rendering environment there are like two type of rendering: client rendering, which happen on the browser of the client, and server, which happen on the server. So just to recap what it means, client is, which is basically the browser on the user device. The server is basically refer to the computer in the data center that store your application code, receive requests from client, does some computation work, and send back to an appropriate response. So that's basically the server. So let's just quick overview what it looked like. I have a rendering branch over here, which is a new branch, and you guys can find the link down below and go to the link and just click on the rendering branch to find the rendering exercise code. Let's show you guys quickly what's happening. Let's create. So whenever we create a folder, right? Let's say we create a folder in we create a route called about, and then we create a file called page.jsx, which is a mandatory file to create a UI for our route, basically. So what happens if we create an about page, right? Is by default, Next.js gives you a server component. So in React 18, React introduced something called React Component. Next.js kind of extended and gave you guys like a server component. So by default, everything inside is a server component. That means it's rendering on the server. So if I like console log here, like server component, and of course I run the server, you see what happened in here is I go to the client UI. The console log will happen on the server. So if I go to the about page now, about page, server component console log on the server, but when I go to the browser console log, it never console log on the browser. So the rendering is being done on the backend and the server. I have a diagram, by the way. I know like this concept may be a little hard to learn for some people. So I made sure I have a diagram as well to kind of give you like a visual representative of things. So I'm going to go to the diagram in a little bit, but just before I do that, I also want to show you if you want to use a client component, what you have to do is use a directive called use client on the top, and it will automatically become a client component. See, when I refresh, it doesn't server component in here anymore. The console log is happening on the browser. So now it's a client component. That means it's been rendered on the browser instead of the server. With that being said, Next.js gives you the privilege to choose client component or a server component. It's up to you what you want to do. But by default, Next.js opt into a server component. So whenever you create a component, it's going to be a server component. If you want to change it to a client component, you use this. So let's go to the diagram to show you how the rendering is actually happening, right? So here we are back to our diagram, and this is like the server side rendering diagram. Now, just to pay attention, I have like number 1, you see number 2, number 3, number 4. These are like the step at which is occur. So this is like a very basic diagram to show you how the rendering works. So on the left hand side, you have a browser. On the right hand side, you have the server. So what happens when you go to nextjs.org, nextjs.org, you request to type it on the browser, you press enter, and what happened is the first step, number 1, request for data. It find the IP address or for your nextjs.org, and the server kind of find the IP address and goes to that, find whatever files you need, which is number 2. Renders happen on the server. So the server find, you want to go to the nextjs.org, it finds the file you need, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and it kind of gather all the file, it loads the file on the server. So on the server, the render is happening on the server. So it loads the file and it sees the whole website, the whole structure of it. It then sends the render response to the browser. So it sends the loaded data, the render data to the browser. And number 4, it reaches your browser and your browser just shows the page. That's it. So the server-side rendering, what some of the takeaway that is happening. One takeaway that is happening is like the render is happening on the server, not the client, not the browser. So one major benefit of that is your browser don't have to load the data that the server sent. So server already loaded the data for you. So that kind of clears out some of the JavaScript that's been loaded on the server. So you don't need to do some heavy lifting on the browser. And for example, if someone have like a slow internet, if you are using server-side rendering on your page, they won't face much problem because the server already rendered the data and then they send the data back to the browser. So the browser is not loading too much JavaScript. So it kind of, gives you a faster, more optimized approach to rendering the content. One other very major key part that is also happening is the SEO. We are going to have a lecture about optimization, and I'm going to be diving more into SEO. But for now, when you render the data, when you render the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the server already have all the content loaded for you. So when it sends to the browser, those content are already loaded, and it's easier for the search engine crawler to crawl through a website and then find the word and content. So it's very SEO friendly. If you're using server-side rendering, you have like a very high chance of getting a better search engine results. So that's the server-side rendering, and most of the server component kind of goes through this, follow this direction. So let's talk about the client-side rendering. So in the client-side rendering, we have something a little different. Now I kept it very minimal. I'm not using very fancy word because this is a tutorial after all. We are trying to understand what's happening behind the scene. We are not trying to get too technical with everything. We're gonna get a little bit more advanced a little later after we understand the server-side rendering and client-side rendering. But for now, let's check out what's happening on the client. On the client, when you go to nextjs.org, let's pretend this time the Next.js is just client-side rendering is happening on the site. So you request the data, you press enter, you request the data to the server. Server grabs the pages that is required, and then it just sends the pages to the browser. So the server is like, okay, I found the pages, I'm gonna send you the pages. It doesn't do any extra work. It does not render. So the page, it just grab and send it to the browser. It's not being rendered on the server. And when the server sends the pages to the browser, this comes to number 4. Step number 4, browser loads and render the pages received. It received the pages and then it rendered it on the browser. So see what's happening? It's kind of like not that efficient. Like your browser is loading the JavaScript, HTML, and CSS and everything that comes with it. And if you have a slower internet, it's gonna take a long time to kind of like load it on the browser and then show you the UI and everything. It's not that performative and optimized, but one thing that it gives you is like interactivity. So when you have all the JavaScript being loaded on the browser, you have very high interaction happening. So if you are using some interactive component, you need to opt into the client-sided rendering. That's the major down part and the advantage. So if you're using interactive, client-sided is needed for you to, gives you all the benefit of interaction. But let's talk about some of the not so good thing about client-side rendering is the SEO. I think when you're building a website, SEO is very important. Like if you're building an app which user have to log in and then do some interaction, you don't need server-side rendering that much. That time you need client-side rendering. But if you have some kind of a blog post or like a portfolio, you want a news website, you want to opt more into server side, because on the client side, the server is not rendering the content. So the crawler is not able to find the content. So when the search engine crawls through a website, it's not able to find the content because the rendering is happening on the browser. So it's kind of like a little disadvantage on the SEO side of things. But you get the idea, like there's a difference between client-sided and server-side rendering. If you're using a client component, it will give you the benefit of a client-side rendering. If you're using server component, it will give you the server-side rendering benefit. So let's go back to our code base here. I think that diagram helped you guys. I hope you understand. I know I kind of like repeat sometime about, I'm trying to make sure you guys understand everything. If you have any question, just comment down below. And also make sure you subscribe and smash that like button. Before I dive in, I want to give you guys one more thing. I mean, we're going to dive into it more deeper. I'm going to show you some advanced stuff. But before I do that, I want to also give you something. And I want to talk to you about the free Next.js guide. So if some of this concept is a little overwhelming, I have a free guide that gives you all the information in very nice way with diagram included. So you just read 1 or 2 pages and you will have all the understanding. So I made this guide for you guys. It's free. Just go to the link down below and sign up on the newsletter. You'll get the guide and also some cool news in the future from me. And the main reason I did this is because if you're doing some interviews in the future, this guide will help you. If you can skim to the guides before doing the interview and you have like a very solid foundation of Next.js in your mind, then you can talk about all this cool features that Next.js have. Grab the guide and let's jump back into the tutorial. So we're back to the code base here, and I just want to recap that. Isn't this cool? Like Next.js gives you best of both worlds. You can use client-side rendering, you can use server-side rendering, and you get like the benefit of both worlds. So in one of these pages, you can do like a client rendering. In other pages, you can do a server rendering. So you kind of like pick and choose what you want, which is really cool about this Next.js feature. I also want to remind you that by default, everything inside is going to be server component. So by default, Next.js already optimized the website for you. So that means allowing you to easily render the component on the server, reducing the amount of JavaScript being sent to the client. So right now, this is a client component, but if you remove the client component, we're using a server component, and it's basically rendering on the server. The client is not doing much work, so you have like a very optimized application. There's also one cool benefit, like additional optimization that's been happening, and this happening in both server-side rendering and client-side rendering. So Next.js also gives you an option to optimize rendering on the server with static and dynamic rendering. So what that means, with static rendering, if you opt into a static rendering, both server and client component can be pre-rendered on the server at build time. So the result of the work is cache and reuse for your request. So what that means is like, If you're using, if you opt in for the static site generation, it's going to be cache, or some of the result of the pre-rendered data will be cache, and you have the benefit of making your application a little faster. So in addition to client and server side rendering, you have also something called dynamic rendering that you can use on both server and client component. And this is basically is going to be rendered at a specific request time, and it's not cache. So your work is not cache. So the most important part right now for you guys to differentiate is the server side rendering and the client side rendering. And I want to talk to you guys before we kind of go on to the next data fetching tutorial. I want to talk to you about a little bit of a detail on the server side rendering, and that is something called streaming. So I want to bring this up to you guys here as well. So streaming with Suspense. I think when you watch some Next.js video, like on their official website, they sometimes talk about streaming, like streaming is this thing. And for a beginner developer, it's kind of hard to kind of understand, like, what is streaming? So I want to make sure you guys understand this and you have like a very strong idea. In the previous lesson, we talked about the suspense. Remember, we have like a suspense like this. If you use a loading.js, it gives you a suspense by default. You don't have to configure this. It's all Next.js already add this when you have a loading.js. So they also optimize with something called streaming. So what happened is when you are doing some server-side rendering, this is what happening, right? This is more like a magnified version of the server-side rendering. If all the data are given for a given page is fetched on the server then renders the page, like render the HTML, CSS, JavaScript for the page, and they send those to the client. Once it's rendered, it sends to the client. Now, this is what happened when the data is being sent to the client. So in the previous version of the diagram, I didn't show you this because we were trying to learn the basics, but this is like for the streaming purpose. When it goes to the client, a non-interactive user interface is shown using the generated HTML and CSS. So a non-interactive, this is the keyword. That means a page is shown, but you won't be able to interact. You won't be able to click any of this. It's just a page that is shown. And finally, React hydrates the user interface to make it interactive. So React slowly start putting all the UI in place and start making it more interactive. So what happened is Next.js optimized this process, this 2, 4, and 5 using something called streaming. This caused like a blocking interaction. So your user won't be able to do anything until it hydrates. So it's kind of like blocks your user from clicking on anything, and it's kind of like a very weird experience for the user. It's not like a pleasant experience. So Next.js use Suspense, creates something called streaming. So this 4 and 5 is where the streaming comes in. So let's see what they say. Okay, the streaming allow you to break down the page HTML into smaller chunks and progressively send those chunks from the server to the client. So that means instead of sending everything all at once, it sends the small chunks, small chunk by chunk. So that way, the user is able to interact really quickly. Like this chunk is being sent first. So when the user see the website, the user is able to interact with it instead of waiting for the interaction to load and then interact with it. So the streaming helps you build your application in a more faster way. And you can like also implement this using a suspense. So suspense works by wrapping a component that performs an asynchronous action, showing fallback UI. So you can use this suspense to kind of incorporate the streaming server rendering. So they call it this streaming server rendering. So if you want to progressively render HTML from the server, you can do something like this. But this is more like an advanced concept, but it kind of helps you, like dual interact, allow you to break down the page HTML into smaller chunks and progressively send those chunks from the server to the client. So now we have like a very strong understanding of the streaming side of things. I want to show you guys when Next.js wants you to use a client component and a server component. So here I have like a presentation, back to the presentation again. And I want to show you guys when to use server component versus client component. Since we talked about the rendering, you guys know they have like a different style of rendering. So for server component, you want to use the server component when you fetch the data, when you access the backend resources directly, when you keep sensitive information on the server, and keep large dependencies on the server, you want to use server component, which is by default, it is a server component. But if you want some interactivity, like we talked about, when you want interactivity, you want to use client-sided rendering. That's when you want to use a client component. So when you use on click, on change, any kind of React hook as well, use state, use reducer, use effect, browser only API, custom hooks, React class component. So when you're usually doing some kind of interaction, you want to opt into a client component, which is the use client directive on the top of the file. And other than that, if you want to do some other stuff like the first 4 points, you want to go with a server component. So I hope you guys have like a very strong foundation on that, the server-side rendering, client-side rendering, server component, client component. And I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial. Make sure you smash the like button and subscribe to my channel. I also have the free guide, Next.js free guide. So make sure you go in there and grab your free guide as well. And before I leave you, I want to talk to you about what we're going to cover on the next lecture. The next lecture is going to be about data fetching. Now, this is where things get really interesting because Next.js introduced something called server action, which is really awesome to work with. I personally use that in one of our full stack course on Next.js, which is a course on my channel, and it's really awesome to work with. So we're going to explore a little bit of that, and we're going to be exploring how Next.js want us to fetch data. I also explain a lot of those in the free guide as well. So I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial. I will see you on the data fetching lecture next.